Even if you don't know much about the Bible, you've probably heard that there are 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. But wait a moment. I heard that there are books that could have become part of the New Testament but were rejected, such as the Gospel of Thomas, Judas, Mary Magdalene and others. Maybe they contain the true teachings of Christ, but the authorities didn't like it, and so they rejected them. Okay, so let's first ask ourselves, what is the New Testament anyway? From our contemporary perspective, it's just that, a book, or a part of a book, the Christian Bible. We see that it contains the Gospels and the Apostolic Epistles, in which we read the words of Jesus and the Apostles, and them constantly telling us what to do and what not to do. Now, if there's a New Testament, it implies the existence of an Old Testament, right? Oh, you mean the thicker book, right? This one. Well, yes and no. The Greek word diatheke, translated as testament, corresponds with the Hebrew word brith, meaning a covenant. So now let's see, what was the Old Covenant all about? In the book of Exodus we read, "And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain, and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he threw against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, 'All that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient.' And Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, 'Behold the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words.'" This is how the covenant between God and his people was sealed. So basically the idea was that he would bless them under the conditions stipulated in the deal. They were to follow all that was written in the book of law. Unfortunately, their human nature got the better of them, and they repeatedly broke this law. But this was merely to be a shadow of a new kind of covenant that was to come in the future. An example of such prophecy is found in the book of Jeremiah. "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, 'Know the Lord,' for they shall know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more." So the new covenant was not merely another set of rules. It had been tried before and it failed. Now, the law of God was to be put in the hearts of men, on the inside. In other words, their nature would change to harmonize with the law of God, so that they could become the children of God and partakers of the new covenant. This is what the Gospels talk about. Now as they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it, broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat. This is my body." And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink of it, all of you. For this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. So the new covenant signified here does not mean just a brand new set of do's and don'ts, but it was a work or the sacrifice of one man, Jesus, who became the mediator and by whom the covenant with God was secured to all that would be willing to take part in it. And these wonderful news are contained in the Gospels, which the Greek word for it, evangelia, means good news. So it was good news for everyone, Gentiles, Jews, all who were willing to take part in it. Alright, but anyways, why 4 Gospels and not 5 or 10? I mentioned in my previous video that these news were pretty fresh in the memory of the growing church when they were written down. And it happened in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. It was something that happened in their time and among them. It was really fresh to them, and then it was written down. Also at the same time the apostolic epistles were written, and all those writings since the early times of the church circulated in the early communities, and they were acquainted with them, those people, the early Christians. The earliest Christian sources after the apostles, such as Justin Martyr or Irenaeus, 2nd century AD, speak of the 4 Gospels. Apart from that, we need to keep in mind that at that time Christians did not think in terms of a canon, of a closed canon, because individual books were read and copied separately, and full codices or like folios containing all books weren't really in use back then. And these huge thick volumes, when I think of it now, would be pretty impractical to carry around, especially when you remember you could get killed for owning one. Anyway, from the beginning, there was agreement on the most important and fundamental books, such as the Gospels, already mentioned, and most of the epistles of the Apostle Paul. There were other books in the New Testament that we have, as old and well known to the church community, but there were discussions about them among theologians. For example, some had doubts about James because his epistle seemed to contradict Paul's teaching about salvation. 2nd and 3rd John seemed more personal and not entirely relevant to the whole church. 2nd Peter was written in a slightly different style than his first epistles, so some had doubts about its authenticity. Hebrews said nothing about the author. Jude quoted the apocryphal book of 1st Enoch, while the book of Revelation was difficult to understand with all its apocalyptic imagery and visions. Ultimately, however, all these books had been known, and it was more because of the insight and caution that made some theologians pay attention to these issues, and most of them insisted on their authenticity and inspiration. In addition to these books, there were other popular writings that were in circulation among Christians at that time, such as the Shepherd of Hermas, the letters of Clement of Rome to the Corinthians, and other that were considered valuable and worth copying, but not part of the canon. Now it was an entirely different thing with the later onslaught of different Gospels, which were named after Jesus' apostles or other biblical figures. They sprang up generations after the Gospels and apostolic letters had been written. Secondly, most of them share a completely different theology than that known from the canonical books. Namely, they taught Gnosticism. Gnosticism is a modern broad term for a whole group of movements contemporary to early Christianity that referred to a special secret knowledge, supposedly from Jesus himself, which was not presented openly. Their teaching on salvation was not rooted in the death and resurrection of the Messiah, but in the attainment of a kind of secret knowledge. He came supposedly to reveal to a chosen few. Moreover, These teachings combined Greek philosophy with elements of Christianity and taught that the God of the Old Testament is a different God than God the Father, and was a bad, or at best, an ignorant deity responsible for the creation of the material world, which in their philosophy all matter was evil. Jesus, on the other hand, was supposed to be this messenger of the higher, good God, and therefore the ultimate goal of Gnostics was to be rid of all matter and their body and unite with the spiritual absolute. Interestingly, these tendencies were present already in the lifetime of the Apostle John, who wrote about it and warned about them in his first epistle. Believe not all spirits, but try spirits to see if they are of God. Every spirit that says that Jesus came in the flesh is from God. Without the context, these words seem pretty vague, or they don't convey much, or don't make much sense to some. But it was the Gnostics who taught that Jesus only gave the impression that he took on flesh, because actually he really did not become incarnate at all, because all physical matter was evil. This is what you can find in those Gnostic Gospels and other Gnostic writings. In other words, it is pretty easy to distinguish one type of writing from another. From our perspective, all these texts, canonical or not, all seem just as old, because they were all written a long time ago, but the difference between them is more or less the same as between today and the times of the French Revolution in the 18th century. One of the most prolific and eminent early Christian writers, Irenaeus, in the 2nd century, wrote a very extensive work entitled Against Heresies, in which he first describes very precisely what the followers of particular currents within Gnosticism believed, like Marcionites, Valentinians, etc. And then, on the basis of the scriptures, he pointed out their contradictions and inconsistencies, also with the Old Testament and the Gospels. At that time, a uniform canon of Christian scriptures had not yet existed. Apart from the oldest ones, various Christian writings circulated among Christians, and in various regions, different bishops presented opinions on the aforementioned marginal issues. So some read the Apocalypse of Peter instead of the Apocalypse of John. Some churches in the East did not read the Apocalypse or the Epistle to Hebrews, but all adhered to the same core. Over time, all communities independently became convinced of these last questionable texts, of their authenticity. And those that were not as esteemed among Christians were just simply copied less and less. Thus, by the 4th century, it was largely known which texts were considered inspired. So again, early Christians didn't think of their writings in terms of a canon. They didn't have a notion of a single book, but that gradually changed as a reaction to the challenges and various attempts at compromising their teaching, and it was fixed long after most Christians had agreed on what did constitute the writings of the apostles and the evangelists and what didn't. So it only confirmed the status quo. But the most important part is that it wasn't just about human agreement. The teaching of the New Testament was at heart of these texts, and they were its carriers as something living, as something with its spirit. Thank you for watching my video. Give it a thumbs up if you liked it, or leave a comment below if you'd like to add something. I also encourage you to subscribe to my channel for more videos. You can also leave a comment if you'd have a subject for a future video. I'd appreciate that. So thank you for your attention, and see you next time.